Welcome all. My name is John Bird, and I am representing the Office of Strategic Engagement here at JSAL. Today we are pleased to present a distinguished speaker including audience Q&A. This session is unclassified and will be recorded and posted to the JSAL network. Please keep in mind that the views and opinions expressed by all participants do not necessarily reflect the views, opinions, or policy of the U.S. government, the Department of Defense, or U.S. SOCOM. If you have any questions after this session, please email thinkjsal@jsal.us as indicated on the slide.
Hey, Paul, it's great to see you.
Hey, good to see you, David.
Hey, I really appreciate you joining us today.
Anything for you, man. I'm excited. I've worked with special ops most of my career, so I'm excited to do anything I can to help in that area.
So, one of the reasons we wanted to get you on is because of your rich experience in your fascinating career in both the DoD and in the CIA, and the numerous times that you've really worked interagency and your experience building partnerships working in interagency. Looking at your bio, you start off as a field artillery officer. You continued in the Army even when you left to work for the agency. Lengthy career at all the levels up to the senior levels. In addition, you worked with NATO, you've worked with combatant commands, you've worked with DNI. So I think you're uniquely positioned to speak with SOF professionals and give them some tips about navigating the interagency, understanding the interagency. So with that in mind, I wanted to, really start off real broad and talk about how important the interagency coordination is to special operations from your perspective.
Well, I want to talk about that in just a second, and I'm kind of an evangelist on the idea of interagency cooperation and coordination integration. I just want to add to my bio something kind of interesting. Is I was both on the analytics side and the operational side as when I got into the intel business, and on the analytics side, I was the chief of the insurgency branch and the director of analysis, which, was a very special operations oriented. That was our biggest military customers, working with those guys. And then at the end of my career, I was the deputy director of counterterrorism center, and that was special ops all day, And then the very last thing I did was be the chief of the tradecraft and training division, which included training a lot of special operators. So I have a special place in my heart for the special operations community, even though I was never one myself. So yeah, I believe that every special operations operator, it's not just that they need to be aware of the importance of coordination. They actually need to be sort of ninjas, special operators in that sense also, and recognize that at fairly junior levels, special operators can to be coordinated, that you have to be much more senior in a conventional side of the U.S. military before you get into those environments typically. And there are exceptions. If you're, a captain commanding a company in Afghanistan, you probably did a lot of coordination. But I think that you also special operators need to develop themselves as what I call enterprise leaders, and we'll come back to talk about that more later. And to go beyond cooperation in some cases to actually integration, which is a term I would also like to come back to. So yeah, I'm a big believer in it. And I as I say this, I know that there's some folks out there in the joint special ops community that are kind of rolling their eyes going, yeah, okay, great. I didn't really sign up to be a special operator because I wanted to be a coordination ninja with, a bunch of civilian agencies. That's not why I joined up. And so, I want to parachute into a hostile area, run 5 clicks, shoot a bunch of guards and then rescue a hostage. And I would say, well, that's cool. And guess what? Even for that very military operation and very special operation, there's a hell of a lot of coordination. And I say that not in the abstract, but because I was the deputy director of CTC and the lead coordinator from the agency when SOCOM forces rescued Jessica Buchanan. And I can tell you, there were many, many coordination meetings before we ever did that. General Votel was the leader of that, but I mean, we're talking about, Admiral Mullins running meetings with John Brennan from the White House on there. What kind of intel can we support? At the very beginning, a great example of this need for coordination is we knew in general where she was, but we didn't know exactly where she was. And kind of important if you're going to do a rescue to know exactly where she is. Well, guess who had to go find her? IC. So, and an even better known example of that is bin Laden. So when you go from conventional operations to and even from kinetic manhunting operations to what we call the gray zone, this hybrid warfare area that our Russian friends are talking about a lot, whatever you want to call it, gray zone, hybrid warfare. And you get into things like political action, countering disinformation, cyber, even counterinsurgency, I would put in this. Not only do you have to coordinate a great deal, but often DoD won't be the lead agency. And there's going to be more and more critical national security issues where big parts of DoD are supporting agencies to other lead agencies. So anyway, I don't think we have to be experts at this to get, you can succeed in your career without being an expert at this, but we have to be experts in it if we want to win, if we want to succeed at the tactical level. So if we don't care about winning, we don't have to do this. But if you look at the recent events in Afghanistan, I'm not here to talk about that. It's off the subject, but I don't think we coordinated what we were doing well there. And they can say, oh, we were coordinating all the time. Yeah, well, you weren't coordinating effectively all the time. And so that's my editorial comment. Doesn't represent anybody, including even my school. But so you got to be able to do this if you want to prevail for certain situations that we do.
One of the things I failed to mention when I first introduced you, when we're speaking about your background, is that, you not only have the practitioner experience at all those levels, but over the last, 4 or 5 years, you've led a group of students and you've actually studied and researched interagency operations and considered it as an academic objective look on it. And so from both those experiences, can you, give, some of the ideas to optimize interagency interactions, some of the key concepts you think are important to navigating the interagency?
Yeah, I'll try to do that. And what you're talking about, if I can just hold these up as a prop, this one has some notes in it, but this one is called Interagency Performance and Counterterrorism Operations. And this is quite a lengthy document. It's about 97 pages. And this is one I led. These are groups of graduate students at the University of Texas. And this was called Domestic Terrorism in the Digital Age. And both of those, especially in the first one, Interagency Performance, we were explicitly looking at how well we did interagency things in the counterterrorism world and what we learned from that and what we could apply. And digress for a second back to, not digress, but bring into this conversation, your previous conversation with Chris Costa, who's a friend and a guy I just immensely respect, and I have to speak to my classes occasionally also. And I've taken people, when he was on the NSC, he was actually the sponsor of this. He was actually the sponsor for this study when he was on the National Security Council. But Chris was very optimistic, and he's a very positive guy about we've learned all these lessons on interagency cooperation. And I really hate to disagree with Chris on everything, but I think Chris has learned all those lessons and some other people have learned those lessons, but I'm not sure that the lessons are all learned. And when we did this study, we asked people, like, have we applied the lessons that we learned in counterterrorism with regard to interagency collaboration to cyber? And I remember distinctly 3 separate seniors, very senior people, like one former DNI, for example, and one former director of PA, who both laughed when we said that and said, no, not in the least. We haven't applied those lessons. And then the other thing that what I'm saying is we need to know, what are the lessons? We've identified a lot of lessons. And now what you're doing with your education and training is trying to make sure that we institutionalize those lessons. And so my point is that a lesson learned, we call them lessons learned. Well, we wouldn't call them, why do we keep talking about the same lessons if we learned them? So, we didn't learn them. Yeah, so what I'd like to do today, if I could, is just kind of talk about how we analyze the need to analyze the environment for organization that requires, or not as our mission, I should say, to to then look at the environment and say, well, who are our key partners and what kind of relationship do we have and what is required? And then another thing is, what are the actual practical steps that you can do? What are some things you can just do? You know, some of them are common sense. What should we avoid doing? And then I wanted to end on kind of a, or not end, but another thing I want to cover was kind of a list of pathologies about what can go wrong. Well, anyway, let me pause there and see if I was getting at your question.
No, definitely. You know, it's the issues you describe and you discuss, especially with the broad focus of understanding the environment. It seems to me, at least from a military perspective, in my experience, that over the last 20 years, we've appreciated and we've improved on understanding what I would call the other, or outwardly trying to better appreciate those environments which we enter. Now, I would still say we have a long ways to go. I think something that's often overlooked is we don't really appreciate our own environments. And when I say our, I mean the broad we, really, you know, the interagency, some of the interests, some of the, personalities, some of the, just the cultures, institutional cultures. And, I don't really think that, to use military speak, I don't really think we can come up with feasible courses of action if we don't understand ourselves and what is actually feasible to, what's actually feasible to achieve and what's actually feasible plan to implement. So yeah, I think it's a great place to start.
Well, let me just say that make a little caveat here, two little comments I'll make about my comments going forward. One is that I may sound a bit critical of DoD today because we're talking about DoD, we're in the DoD context, but I was kind of a broken record on this as the Chief of Tradecraft and Training. And before that, I was the Assistant Deputy Director of National Intelligence for strategic partnerships. So partnerships was literally in my title. And then they changed that job around and I was the Assistant Director of National Intelligence for Partner Engagement. So I thought a lot about this with other agencies aiming this need to coordinate better at the FBI, the CIA, and other organizations, and myself in some cases. So this isn't, I just want to say this is not aimed at DoD. You guys need to get your act together with regard to coordination. This is everybody. And the second thing is I would like to spice or sprinkle into this kind of, in theory, here's how you do it, some real world anecdotes that speak to these issues and maybe illustrate the problem and ground what we're talking about. And so you were talking about getting to know your environment. So I'm going to tell a real quick little story in response to that question. And it's outside the military. So when I was the AD&I, and they the director decided that he was going to have that be a senior FBI officer in certain parts of the country. And there were like 54, 56 FBI offices, but he only had like 26 of these D&I reps around the country. So New York was a very important place. There was already a New York JTTF, which is an interagency task force. That's literally what it is. It was a standing body to coordinate. But this D&I rep thing, which the FBI inherited, I'm not even sure if they do that anymore, if they have them, or if the FBI still is the designated person for it. But at this time it was. And so I flew up for the first ever New York meeting, D&I rep meeting held by the senior bureau officer that they had appointed to do that. Not the senior most bureau officer in New York, who's an assistant director, but I think maybe the head of the JTF or another officer, another agent. And so I go up there, he's a very friendly guy. We meet before this meeting. There's all these guys are gonna come in for this meeting. And he's telling me how excited he is about this and how much, and he kept going back to his mission and how much this was gonna help him with his mission. And he kept repeating, I think this isn't a waste of time. It's really gonna help us do our mission. And he finishes and he says, Paul, do you have any advice for me? And about what I say to these guys? And I said, yeah, I do. If you want some frank advice, we had like 5 minutes before we walked in. And he said, yeah, I said, don't talk about your mission. Talk about their mission. I said, if I were you, I would go in and say, we're going to get to know one another. And I need to know what you're doing, what your capabilities are, what you have challenges with. And I need to tell you what the challenges we're as a group need to work on together. And so he goes in and he does that. And it just blew everybody away. I mean, we had, at that meeting was, some of the most senior people from Customs and Border Patrol in New York, the NYPD chief of intel, the senior DEA guy for New York, several state police agencies, Treasury, Port Authority, security, all kinds of people. They start briefing what their challenges were, like, how many ships come into New York Harbor and they get inspected for bombs and all that, and what their capabilities are. And what I'm trying to say is that he got what he wanted, which was figuring out how they could help him. But it was really developing a team. It was a very positive meeting. And I look at that as just, sometimes we just need to switch our thinking a little bit to this enterprise, this collective enterprise, which was protecting that part of America from another terrorist attack. And as you know, they were pretty motivated. So anyway, I think that everybody has to develop an understanding of kind of the players on the battlefield, in this case, who aren't, like when you do, in the Army, at least, we used to do MET-T, Mission Entity Troops Terrain Time Available, okay? Well, most people just skip over that troops part. This is the analysis of who your friends are. This is the analysis of the friendly forces that are available to go to the fight with you. And it's really important that you see it as part of mission analysis and do it intentionally.
And I think that ties into an earlier point that you made, talking about as we shift from GWOT and into this, what has been called strategic competition. DoD is now referring to it as integrated deterrence. It's that, not just focusing on the support that our institution needs, the supporting effort to the supported effort, but on how we can support others, right? How we can be an enabler, how we can be there. And, and then back to the integrated deterrence, one of the interesting things, I think, with the integrated deterrence concept, which I think is a good approach generally, but there's a concern on my end that maybe it's DoD only speaking about integrated deterrence, and there's not this collective type of interagency. And so we're speaking internally about the importance, but not really not externally, you know what I mean? We're not all coming together. So it's still very parochial.
Yeah, there's no doubt about that. There's no doubt. And in fact, this is one where I'm going to sound like I'm particularly picking on DoD. And in this particular case, maybe this might be the exception where I am kind of picking on DoD, because nobody is worse at what you're talking about than DoD, or nobody is more prone to making a mistake, speaking for the collective we, when they haven't talked to the collective we or gotten the collective we's opinion. So when Catherine says we're going to have a collaborative, integrated national approach to this, who is putting that together? The National Security Council doesn't have, that's not their job. They don't, they coordinate at the senior level and set policy, but they don't, execute operations. They don't, conduct campaigns. And so often DoD has all the throw weight for planning and is really resentful if anybody else tries to get involved in that planning. And then the plan comes out and it says, we're going to do this and we're going to do that. And so when you get in, there's lots of examples of this, but just one that I think is really important is like both in Iraq and Afghanistan, I was both places. The military was like really frustrated, like, where's all the civilians that we need to help us do this and do that and do this? And there was none of that in the planning phase. And the only organization in the U.S. government, one of the only ones in the U.S. government that maintains a large part of its cadre for contingencies. Firemen do that, and a few other people do that. But everybody else has a job, and they're not training for some future thing or on the shelf. So when you want civilian agencies to actually pony up resources or something like that, you especially need them involved. So yeah, I worry about that. I worry about it as well. And when we get into the details of how one might avoid, avoid some of that, I think there's some obvious things you can do. And you're going to have to push back on your own bureaucracy in some cases. So an example would be, it's a natural thing. If you and I were talking about this before, but if, for example, let's say your boss is trying to develop options to present up the chain of command, and let's say your boss is a COCOM commander, And so you're developing operations or maybe not a COCOM commander, maybe it's the commander in Iraq or Afghanistan. And they're looking at, let's say, closing some bases. Let's say that that's the thing that's on the table. And so they say, well, we don't want anybody to panic. So let's not tell AID and CIA and state what we're doing until we decide what we're doing so that we're all speaking with one voice. Well, can you see the hole in that plan? You're leaving out huge planning considerations that should be taken into account when you do that. And often those plans are just shot down. I've seen it repeatedly where, in fact, on base closure in particular, I've seen it in 3 different countries and 3 different jobs that I was in. One as a DNI rep to U.S. Pacific Command, one as the Deputy Director of Counterterrorism, and one as when I was a chief of TTD. And you wouldn't think that would Tradecraft and Training Division. You wouldn't think that I would be involved in that case, but I was, because we were preparing people to go to those bases. So I was on the War Zone Planning Board that looked at that. And in all 3 cases, the military was very frustrated because they did all this work on the plan and then it got shot down. And the reason was they didn't get the input earlier. But to get that input, they would have had to spoken to their seniors and said, could you please take off the restriction with regard to coordination? And there's techniques for doing that. You can call it a planning process. You can issue a warning order. You can give a heads up at a more senior level. There's ways to do it. But yeah, when DOD is a 600-pound gorilla, has more action officers than the CIA has employees, and they are the ones typically tasked with doing a lot of the planning. And so they have a special responsibility to coordinate and bring those.
You make me think of 2 things. You make me think of the and I guess I would break them down into preparation and implementation. And so preparation, how do individuals, how does the soft practitioner who, how do they prepare mentally, intellectually for the operating within an agency? How do they build that understanding to prepare them to go, right? So that, whether it's self-education, whether it's institutional education, what would you recommend they focus on,
That's a great question. And I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, and then the second part is continuation. I think it's to your point about the, the practical techniques in the actual implementation, like how to go about it, how to be a good interagency partner and take that understanding that you've developed and nurture and actually do practical things to implement it, and kind of key points to keep in mind.
Yeah, well, those are great questions, and there's a lot to do that. Like on the how to think about it part, what I tried to start this conversation with is the very first thing, to be repetitive one second. The very first thing is to not see this as a distraction that you have to get past so you can do your real job. This is your real job. Okay. Now you might, if you're a junior enlisted door kicker, only, then maybe you can say, well, that's not my job and I refuse to spend any time thinking about it. But as an enlisted SF soldier or SEAL or whatever you are, and certainly as an officer, you are going to spend a lot of time coordinating with both other military agencies and other agencies. So 1 is recognizing that. Okay, 2 is doing what I call mission analysis, looking at the mission that you've been given, and then saying, what are the key enablers in terms of other organizations that we are going to have to work with for this to succeed. So, for example, if you have, you might say the only interagency thing here is a requirement for me to deconflict, this with something else. And so there is a requirement for coordination in some cases that's very much just a kind of a pro forma, send this form to this group, they look at it, they approve it, that kind of thing. You're lucky if that's all you've got. Okay, but then there's other situations where you literally need to build a team. And so in answering your question, I'm jumping from a very specific analysis of the situation back to how do you prepare yourself mentally? 1, you need to read always. You need to constantly be curious and reading and self-educating on how things work and how organizations, what's happened in other wars, what's happened in other conflicts, I mean, I have a copy of a study called Bureaucracy Does Its Thing, which was written by the senior CIA guy that was put in charge of what President Johnson called the other war in Vietnam, meaning the counterinsurgency and the information war and that kind of thing. And he wrote a book about what it was like to try to coordinate all that stuff. But there's a lot you can read on that. I think as you go through your career, you have lots of opportunities in which you will be part of and see coordination. And I think if you're intentional, I keep using that word intentional. Another word I would use is reflective, like what made that work. And then there's also some things about just theory or what is known about bureaucracies and organizational behavior and things like that that are useful. I mean, just for example, I there's a lot of gimmicky stuff out there in management literature, but one I learned years ago that has been enormously helpful to me is a term, you may have heard it: form, norm, storm, perform. Okay, so if you're an A team, you're going to be directed onto that. So the forming is going to happen, by other people given an order for that to happen. The norming is people getting to know one another, but there are roles that have already been assigned. And then, storming is when that group figures out who's going to do what, and who's the leader, and how we do our briefings or whatever it is. When you have to do that at an interagency level, and you have to get to a point where you're performing at some level of interagency coordination and performance, it takes time to do that. And there's nothing that says that you will go down that's it, form to storm to norm perform. There's nothing that says you have to ever get to performance. You can stay at storm. And by the way, it should be form, storm, norm, perform. I said it wrong. I said form, norm. It's form, storm. You're not the boss of me. Yes, I am. No, you're not. That's storming. Okay. Once you settle that, you can start norming. Okay, you do this, I'll do that. We'll have a morning briefing. We'll exchange information. I'll coordinate any strike I'm going to do like this. You do that. That's storming. Then you can perform. To me, that's a helpful little thing, because if you apply that to the interagency, it's extremely humbling. You're like, wow, there's a lot of different moving parts here, and we got to get all of those people on board. There are techniques, and we can talk about these in a minute, that you can do. You can cause that to happen. So I want to just share something, if you don't mind. It's something we used in one of those papers that I wrote. And so when I was talking about this analysis that you need to do, you need to ask yourself a question. Two questions. Where are we as a group now on this spectrum? If you have somebody you sort of barely know them, and every now and then you deconflict with them, but now they're going to be a critical partner, then clearly you need to move down that. You don't always need to invest the resources. This is a resource investment into building teams around every little problem. Cases, collaboration, coordination, exchanging notes, getting together occasionally is fine. In other cases, I just got this is just a little intellectual tool to kind of think about the fact that if you want to get over here to integration and interdependence is extremely hard to get to in the interagency. It means that, and we did in the counterterrorism world in a number of places, we got to it, like manhunting and HVT targets and things like that. I think we really built that kind of an interdependent team where you could, you're going to do this and I'm going to do that, and we're trusting you to do that. I mean, I was there in CTC when we decided to recommend to the president that we ask JSOC to get bin Laden as opposed to using our own resources to get bin Laden. And I personally do not believe that would have happened necessarily in 2002. I'm not sure, but there was no doubt among all the operators that were experienced that had worked in the field that that was a smart thing to do. So thinking about this as just something that must be done, and then we can talk about specific things you can do to do it. But the first two things are, analyzing the mission. What are we going to have to do? And then the last thing on that mission analysis is the who. And by who, I don't just mean identifying who we're going to coordinate with and improve our relationship with and work with, but also how we're going to do that. What's our strategy? What's our plan? And who on our side is going to have the various roles and missions, parts of that, So to develop a relationship, you want to develop an organizational or institutional relationship, right? But ironically, you can facilitate that with, or you must facilitate it with personal relationships. So on the one hand, it's institutional. It means it's got to be more than one person. And on the other hand, it's people to people. And you got to focus on both of those two things. And I think, if people just use their common sense and recognize that this is in fact part of the deal, and just kind of treat organizations the way you would want your organization treated, it usually works out.
One of the things I really like about that spectrum you showed, the scale you showed, and tying it back to the, the push within DoD and a lot of the talk in the current strategic environment regarding integrated deterrence and as in integrated campaigning. And as your spectrum showed, right before interdependence was integration. And so it's on that right part of that scale. And, I think, and the reason I mention that is because I really think it's kind of a mindset kind of change for DoD. And I'll give you an example of what I mean by this. I was in a discussion with someone talking about security cooperation missions, right? And the individual had commented that, it was from a state National Guard, that, security cooperation missions sometimes take away from our wartime mission. And I kind of paused for a second when they said that, because I didn't think the individual I was speaking to, well, I think maybe we should frame what is the use and utility of the military and of us. So instead of thinking, okay, this is distracting me from training to go to a large conventional war, how is this security cooperation effort? How is this building partnerships within the interagency to execute this? How is this in building partnerships with the other, wherever we're providing the security cooperation effort? How is this actually contributing to strategic competition? How is this part of the integrated deterrence to give us a relative advantage over China, Russia? And I don't think there's that mindset in it yet. And I think a part of it, number one, we have to get to that mindset. And then two, to get to that mindset, we need to get to that integrated understanding of the interagency that your spectrum showed.
If I could tie this back to the mission analysis piece for just a second, it's really important when you're doing that partner analysis that you try to figure out what it is that the various partners want. Okay, what is it that they're trying to accomplish? So let me give you a specific hypothetical. So let's say hypothetically, somewhere or another, a mission originates requesting a special forces team of some sort to deploy to a third world country or to a country. And the mission's already aware of this. The special ops guys that get this know that the mission's aware of it. The diplomatic mission, is aware of it. But it's coming from a COCOM and it's a tasking to SOCOM. And maybe the SOC in that particular COCOM area has gotten this mission. Well, and so let's say the mission is to develop some kind of weapons training. There's some weapons training thing you're doing. If you just say a weapons training mission is a weapons training mission is a weapons training mission, and you don't understand why we're doing that, what specifically reason are we doing that? There's a major counterterrorism problem in that country, and we really and truly need to develop kinetic capability in that country so that they can go fight these terrorists, okay? And that's important to U.S. national security, versus they want some counterterrorism training, and what we want is better access to their military, edging the Russians out or somebody else. And, so knowing the strategic purposes behind, or the tactical or operational purposes behind the mission that you're given, will help you with coordination. Also, for example, in that case, did the idea of doing that originate at the COCOM? I would be very quick. This would be an essential piece of information if I were the young officer implementing that, executing that mission with the team. I would want to know, okay, was that a COCOM idea or was that from the diplomatic mission? Are we going to be foisting ourselves on the diplomatic mission who don't think it's a good idea? How can I find the answer to that question? Who are the key players in there? Do I have a relationship? Does anybody at my command have a good relationship? They can fire off an email to the attaché and say, hey, what's the backstory here? Can I do that with the COCOM? You know, and so those are all just within pretty well, the diplomatic mission is getting outside of DOD, but in that case, you know, if you reach out to an attaché, even that is within DOD technically, but it's somebody who's also matrixed into the country team. So understanding why we're doing something and the fact that everybody's mission is not, your mission is not the same as everybody else's. In other words, this is one of the things when I get down to pathologies that I was going to talk about is the assumption that everybody understands that mission and agrees with it is a real bad assumption. They may not understand it. So I don't know if that helps, but I wanted to jump into that. Just what are some practical steps? What is it that we can actually do besides this mindset thing and mission analysis, and it'll kind of weave together. But, you know, one of them, I've already said it repeatedly, but is just being very aware of the barriers to integration. And there's many different things that can be barriers. It could be we've never worked together before. We don't have the same mission. We're far, far away from each other physically. You know, there's a lot of things that can be barriers to integration. We don't like each other, you know, there's a bad history here. You know, I said I was going to sprinkle in some stories, so I'll tell you a story real quick here. So after 9/11, I had some FBI. I was a COS overseas, and I had some FBI guys that came out immediately after 9/11 and were working with us in our station. And one day, one of the bureau guys came in, and I hope you don't mind this war story, but one of the bureau guys came in and said, Paul, my boss wanted me to ask you a question. I said, okay. And he goes, is it true that in August, you told the legal attaché that he was an empty suit and to get the hell out of your office? And I said, hey, look, man, that was just between me and that guy. That's not CIA versus FBI. Don't read it that way. He goes, no. He goes, but did that happen? I said, yeah, I've got to confess that actually happened. I kind of threw him in the office, told him he was an empty suit, because I asked him for some help on some CT stuff and he wouldn't give it before 9/11. And he goes, well, my boss, he's the FBI boss, wanted to confirm that story, and then he wanted me to give you his coin because he thinks he's an empty suit. You know? So, you know, one of the practical steps that I would tell you is it's not okay to paint the whole organization because you met a jerk. Okay, that's not okay. You have to actively fight that. You have to be a leader. You have to squelch it as a leader when you see it in your subordinates. Okay, there's a great story from Beadle Smith, who was the chief of staff for General Eisenhower in SACEUR, and then later became the director of CIA. But when he was the chief of staff and running the headquarters in London near Grosvenor Square, he would give an in-briefing to anybody that was like an 06 or above coming into the staff, and there were a lot of them. And in that in-briefing, he would say, look, you know, we have some jerks. He called them bastards. He said, we have some bastards on the staff. And every now and then one of those bastards is going to need to be told he's a bastard. And if you feel compelled to tell the guy that he's a bastard, I guess that, okay, use your judgment. Try not to do that too often. But if you ever call somebody a British bastard or an American bastard or a Navy bastard, I'm going to ruin your career. And I think that he was saying what I'm trying to say here, that you're going to have these frictions. Don't let the frictions interfere with, don't let them paint the whole organization because you've had a bad experience. And a lot of people do that. I think it's almost human nature, like to, you know, I asked the CIA guy to do this and they wouldn't do it. So they're a bunch of jerks and they didn't care about me. The most important practical step that you can probably do for recurring requirements is to see whether it meets the threshold for either a temporary or permanent exchange of liaison officers. And in exchanging those liaison officers, they need to be, you know, they need to be credible. They need to not just be somebody filling that slot, but somebody that can actually speak, you know, to that command with a credible voice. They, at the technical level, one of the cool things that happens quite often, and if you want to read, you can read about this in Stan McChrystal's books. I mean, he has like literally drawings of where various agency heads agency reps sat and how they did the morning briefing and all that. He went into great detail about that. But this exchange of hostages, we call it, is really can be a really important and useful thing. I think you got to be careful not to just do it. Oh, I love you back. So let's exchange hostage, officers or representatives. But if the representative can both operate on your system, the hosting organization system, and operate on their own system. So, for example, when I was at Paycom, I could turn and get on an agency computer, send direct emails to chiefs of station in the region, reach back to the counterterrorism center, do all those things inside CIA comms. But then I could also be on the, SIPR and JWICs and that same thing was happening with NSA, NGA, everybody else. So thinking about that is important. One of the most important practical steps that organizations can do, military organizations in particular, and this is hard, I think special ops can do it better or should be better at it than others, is delegating, coordinating authority downward. And not just having every single thing be mother may I back, but pushing as much of that coordination as you can, and the responsibility to coordinate wherever you can. Another thing that I think is something that this sounds so common sense, but I've had people come out to my AOR to ask to do something sexy, and they didn't know the basics of the AOR. They didn't know the chain of command. They didn't know what all the subordinate commanders were. They didn't know a lot of the things that you should know, and you can really lose credibility by showing up not knowing it. So use the old hands in your unit that have coordinated before, talk to the attachés, whoever it is that you're working with, and try to find out about it. I'm going to pause for a second, but before I do, I'll just hit one last thing, and that is I mentioned like that dual network access for matrices, and that kind of backs me into technology in general. It's much easier to do this today than it used to be, or let me say it differently. It's still very hard.
To me, what you have me thinking about is it seems too often we come together to like plan, right? To come up and take an action, but we don't have this iterative recurring conversation that's necessary to understand prior to taking action, right? If we accept that the environment is dynamic, maybe we should spend a little more time having these conversations like you're talking about, to where we bring in a bunch of people and we not understand how they see the situation. We start to get a better understanding of their culture, their mission, their focus of their own institutions. And so I think it's something very valuable that we take for granted. I
couldn't agree more. I have some notes that I wanted to mention. And a specific point that you just said, I want to really hammer if I could. One of the biggest mistakes that I see people make, and I've already mentioned it once, is they assume that others, not only that others know what their mission is, but also that they have a similar mission. Okay. And so, for example, just the other day, I was in a very painful, we had 2 days back to back where we had a speaker come in and talk about Afghanistan. And we had, this is at UT, and we had a veterans panel up there. It was I actually couldn't stay for the whole thing. It was just too emotional for me to just, think about these guys that had served over there and lost friends like I did, lost a couple. And we were sort of going through this, and this one guy got up and was he didn't know that I was from CIA. I just asked a question, and he said, like, one thing we could do better, I think, is like, we would ask CIA for help, and sometimes they'd give it, and sometimes they wouldn't give it. And this was a guy in eastern Afghanistan who would have been talking to like Jalalabad base. Well, Jalalabad base had fewer operations officers in it than an infantry squad has. And their mission was high value targets from Al Qaeda in Afghanistan or in Iraq, in Pakistan. And they in developing information and intelligence on them, and finding bin Laden and finding Zawahiri and those kinds of things. So I in both Iraq and Afghanistan spent a hell of a lot of time. If we had a CT mission and it overlapped with the insurgency mission, because there was an overlap between those groups, we bent everything we could towards like force protection and helping the military, to the point that often we were actually neglecting our own mission. And it was never enough. I mean, somebody, David, somebody actually ought to write a book about this. David has written a great book about this exact topic. But but my point is that the military, it has a massive mission, and sometimes it doesn't understand why everybody isn't like bending everything they have to do that. So the first thing you have to do in those conversations is make sure you understand what, for example, in that story I told about the North Korean missile, why is Stratcom at the table? If you walk in and you go, what the hell, Stratcom, what's that? Well, because the missile's range can reach continental United States. That's why. Oh, that's a pretty good reason, and so, learning the missions, learning where people are coming from, learning what their predispositions are with regard to what they're trying to accomplish. This was a very, very soft story, if I could, or anecdote that I saw. There was a country in Southeast Asia, and they were trying to have a regular soft presence in the country team there on a TDY basis, okay? And there was a name for this program, and I'm not sure what's classified what in, but this part of it I'm sure isn't. And so they had this, what they did was they rotated reservists in there for 90 days or 6 months, I can't remember. And they had the same two people that did it sort of back to back for like 3 years. And so I was on a trip around that region with the deputy commander of SOCOM, coming out of PACOM with some other people from PACOM. We went to like 6 or 7 countries, and we heard the story of this country. And the guy tells about how on our first rotation out here, there was all this tension with the attaché and security assistance people. The ambassador wasn't happy with us. He was really upset. The chief of station was mad about some stuff we did, and he was pissed off and didn't want it to continue. And then they go through this, like 5 or 6 rotations that they've done. And basically now everybody's gotten used to us and they like us, and it all worked out. And so the lesson, going back to lessons learned, the lesson is eventually you'll wear them down and they'll get used to you. And so, they kind of finished that briefing, and you have to decide when you're going to keep your mouth shut and when you're going to say something. I had a good relation with these guys. They invited me on this trip. I was a CIA guy, but I was the DNI rep at PACOM. And so, I said, guys, I've just got to speak up here. That you're learning the wrong lesson. That's not what happened. That's not at all what happened here. They got used to you. You came in not knowing anything about what that ambassador is trying to accomplish. And you said, this is what we want to do. And everybody was saying, that's a dumb thing for you to do. And it's going to get you in trouble, and it doesn't help the mission. And then over time, you learned about the missions, and you saw how you could apply your capabilities to their mission sets. And you came in with capability that delighted them, and now they love you. It's not because they got used to you. It's because you learned what they were trying to accomplish and how you could help. And so it's a really important point. The question you asked is profoundly important, and I'll just flip that around the other side too. Another anecdote related to that same trip. On that same trip, let me back up. When I was leaving TTD, about to come down to Texas, they had a going away for me down at the farm where we trained people to be case officers. And one of my officers, one of my instructors came up to me, and I frankly didn't recognize him. He'd grown a big old bushy beard since I saw him in the field, kind of like you, David. And so he comes up to me and he says, "Sir, I just want to talk to you and thank you for that kind of butt chewing you gave me." I was like, "I don't remember giving you a butt chewing. I've heard you're a great instructor and all this stuff." And he goes, No, I'm talking about in the field." And I didn't connect him with this other guy without a beard from a few years before, who was in a small station in Asia, and special operators wanted to come in and do some things. And he was nervous that the thing they were going to do was going to get him in trouble. And there was a lot of tension in that country, and it could have gotten you in trouble. And so he was just basically trying to shut down anything they were doing. And I kind of chewed his ass. I said, "Look, why don't you try to understand what they're trying to accomplish here and find a mission that they can do? You just spent a few minutes bitching about not having enough resources, and here's guys with resources that you're turning away." And so anyway, he listened to them and said, "Look, this is not a good idea. That organization is hostile to us. They're actually penetrated by other people. this is who you want to work with. Could y'all do that? They go back and talk about, anyway, it all worked out. So this isn't just aimed at, hey, special operators need to get their act together. All of us need to think about, like this may sound cliche-ish or kind of funny, but it's like, be an American, dude. Be an American. What is U.S. interest here? What capability does my ally over here in this other organization have to bring to bear? How can I help them succeed? It's not just me being nice, or something like that. It's actually people have phenomenal capabilities that they can bring to bear. And by the way, there's a lot of wonderful examples of this. There's a lot of blood brothers from the war on terror that are cross agency lines. And there's a whole lot of bear hugs. If you have, some older SF guys get together with older CIA guys, you'll see a lot of bear hugging going on. We have shown the pathways in the CT world. We've shown how this can work, how interagency collaboration can work, but that doesn't mean that we're doing that everywhere.
I find you have me reflecting back on my experience as a liaison, and one of the things that was most, I guess, eye-opening to me, being kind of put in the middle between the two institutions, the institution you're representing, and the institution you're representing to, right? Representing for and representing to. But I would listen to requirements coming in and stuff, and it became apparent, I mean, I should say obvious, that there was this fundamental misunderstanding of the other's purpose and mission. And I think one obvious example of that misunderstanding was during the Iraq War, especially early on, as we were shifting into this realization that we were going to be there for years, and it was switching from taking out a regime to nation building. And I would hear people comment like, where's the State Department to do to nation build? And I would smile. I'm like, have you ever asked them if they define their mission as nation building? Because I don't think they would define their mission as nation building. And so you're assigning them a mission because of ignorance and misunderstanding of their role of their institution. And so, to me, it goes back to that. It's, especially in this great power competition, especially if we're going to get to integrated deterrence, and especially if we're going to get to integrated campaigning, there's a requirement, a professional requirement, professional responsibility on a practitioner to understand their partner organizations, agencies, institutional cultures, to appreciate where they come from.
When you're in a fight, like soldiers and sailors, airmen can be in, and especially when you're close enough to the fight that you're losing people, tensions go up and frustration goes up, and you can really get into an arrogant place where you think you are the holder of all things good and patriotic, and other people aren't, And I got hurt in Afghanistan, not by the enemy, and I was escorted out by a young woman who was, killed a few weeks later. I mean, she took care of me on the plane, gave me little morphine pills and stuff, and she was blown up at coast along with another friend of mine, the base chief. And I remember seeing State Department people killed. I mean, it was we were all out there. We weren't all doing the same missions. And you want to be really careful not to be arrogant about like what we're doing is the holy thing here. The other thing I would just say about that story in Iraq, and I think it's a great example, is if you needed a huge nation building capability, I think that we did a bad job of planning on our operations in Iraq. I think we planned to defeat the Iraqi army, and we did that just like I thought we would do it, awesomely, with our awesome military. And we didn't plan on, having a stable democratic government. If we had, then state would have been actually in the lead on a lot of that stuff, and AID. And for example, it's not just that they would have had to allocate more resources, and we would have maybe thought about whether we wanted to do it at all. If that's what success was, we might have thought about it differently. I'm not revisiting Iraq. I'm just saying this is a good example of interagency planning. If those are key actors, get them in on the planning process. We had 6 guys in Chuckaboot show up. That was the plan that CENTCOM came up with. Sorry if anybody on CENTCOM's offended by that, but that's what happened. The guy, Lieutenant General Jay Garner, was going to run the country. with a few people. And the other thing we did was I was out there in '04, and we had bombed the crap out of stuff that we were now trying to rebuild that wasn't necessary to bring down their electrical grid. We didn't have to like take down their entire communications building. It was a flattened, I don't know if you saw it in Baghdad, but there was like one of those 7-layer cakes that used to be a building was where all their servers and routers were. So they, none of that. My point is, if we'd had diversity in the planning process and people thinking about phase 4 from a civilian agency perspective, we would have conducted the kinetic phase even differently. So that's up at the operational strategic level. But, this stuff matters. I mean, I get a little bit upset, I mean, I like I said, I don't need to be melodramatic, but we've all lost friends, and my buddy just took a bunch of guys that had been grievously wounded hunting this weekend and sending me pictures of the deers and stuff. There's long-term consequences of getting this wrong. And I started off kind of joking about, people not wanting to do, to do interagency collaboration or that's not like a key part of their job. But I'll say it very seriously, it's a critical part of your job, and often success or failure hinges on whether we get that right. The last thing I want to kind of talk about a little bit, David, and then take whatever questions you have, but is there's certain things that I've seen them so often that I actually label them as like pathologies. And what I mean by that is like a repetitive mistake that we make that leads to kind of negative consequences. And so I've already mentioned a lot of these, but I'll just repeat a few of them. One is assuming your mission is everyone else's mission. Not knowing the roles and authorities of key players. Chris in his talk said, you don't want to be going into like debating on authorities. And I agree with him on that, but you aren't debating authorities if everybody knows everybody's authorities. And so that's really important to understand, because like, for example, CIA had special authorities in the war zone, and a lot of military folks didn't really understand those authorities in some cases, and we needed to do a better job of explaining them. A real bad pathology is not having a great deal of respect when it comes to national sovereignty. I mean, I was a CIA case officer. I ran around other people's countries and suborned people to commit espionage and stole secrets. So you would say, well, you obviously trampled on national sovereignty. Yeah, but because I was trying not to get caught, I have a great deal of respect for it, and a great deal of respect that that's not my swamp. That's not my swamp. And the U.S. military at the conventional level, when it goes to war, is an awesome machine. But for special operators, often operating when we're not in a war zone, national sovereignty is really critical. And your ambassador and your country team and the host country are really going to be upset if you don't understand that. And I mean, understand it like in your bones. Your commander is not as big a deal there as they are back at your command headquarters. Okay. And the fact that they want something or told you to do something doesn't necessarily mean the point I want to make there, because you guys get classified missions to go in and do MISO and other things. We call it MISO or MISO, whatever, things like that. But when you're getting those orders to go do that, you always remind yourself that it's not just whether you're like actually committing espionage or spying or something like that. It's what do they see? What do they think you're doing? What are they worried about with their military if you're training them, for example? And so really have a big respect for that. I'm going to give you, again, I want to illustrate this with a specific illustration, and it's not from DOD, it's from another agency. But when I was in one of my assignments, I had a cover job, and we had a bunch of senior officials who were going to come visit this country. And we had a kind of a semi-hostile relationship with this country, and we're trying to warm it up a little bit. And anyway, so the ambassador at the time had this requirement that there was exquisite sort of advanced work done before a cabinet level official had an official with a host government, a meeting or something like that. So, I mean, if you've ever done this kind of work, some of you may have been in protocol or something. I mean, it's like, where's the nearest ladies' bathroom? Where's everybody going to sit? What's the seating chart look like? It's all this detail you have to develop ahead of time. And it's not the kind of stuff that anybody signed up to do that I know. But anyway, so I took this person over to a very senior official in that government, this advanced person from I'd already done this, but then the advanced person from the cabinet ministry in the US came, and we go in and there's like a chief of staff outside the office of this cabinet member. So we're in another country's, cabinet ministry, and I bring this American in there, and she's telling this guy how this visit's going to go. So this is the chief of staff to a cabinet official in a very significant country. And this 30-year-old American woman who thinks she's hot shit because she works for a secretary of something or other in the US is basically telling this guy how it's going to go. And I can see she's completely oblivious to the fact that he is steaming. I mean, he's getting more and more angry. And she finally insists, she says, well, we need to see the office. She goes, no, we need to walk in that office and look at it before we go in there. And he goes, well, that's not going to happen. And she raised her voice and told the guy, you don't understand. I've flown all the way from Washington. And he goes, you don't understand. My minister is at work at his desk, and I'm not going to go disturb him so you can look at the seating arrangements for a meeting that we don't even actually have to have. And I just had to literally usher her out of there. I grabbed her by the arm and said, we're leaving. And I just drove straight back to Embassy C. We have some more stops. I said, no, you're not going anywhere. You're not going anywhere because you're an ugly American. You don't understand that you're not, this is not your country. I said, and I remember I said to her, I said, look at those walls over there on the government building. And she looks at them, and I said, you notice there's monkeys on them? And she goes, yeah. And I said, well, there aren't any monkeys on the walls in Washington. Okay. So we can confirm we're not in Washington right now. Anyway, it's a long story, but it's easy to say, I work for a really important, powerful person. And this is both in interagency or in the sovereignty sense, and try to carry that rank with you and just make a lot of enemies. And another thing is, another really important lesson in a pathology is to have someone to villainize or see as the enemy someone who tells you no or recommends that you not do something the way that you're doing it. This is one of the most important things to develop. If you and I have a relationship and you trust me, then when I tell you, hey, David, that's not a good idea, I would invest that money there, I wouldn't do that, then you believe, you take some, if all you do is see whether the guy said yes or not. In fact, that trip that I mentioned earlier, mentioned it twice now because it was the same trip where I talked to that young chief of station. But we were coming back from that trip and we were kind of recounting how it all went. And there were a couple of 07s and 06s on this plane. And we we're kind of sitting around this table talking about how the trip went. And they were saying, Mr. Pope, you got to go with that back with us next year and blah, blah, blah. And I said, yeah, I don't know if I want to do that. They go, really? It was so much fun having you. You were so much contributed so much. And we really got so much out of this trip. And they said, why would you want to go? And I said, because you met with 6 chiefs of station and 2 of them told you no and 4 of them told you yes. And you've consistently referred to the 2 who told you no as assholes. They're both friends of mine. And if I did a fruit basket turnover and all 6 of them changed jobs, the people in those 2 locations would still be saying no because what you're proposing is a dumb idea. But you think my friend's an asshole because what he told you is a dumb idea. He's trying to help you. He's not trying to hurt you. There's things he knows that you don't know, okay? And he's trying to explain that to you and you're not accepting his help. And so that disappoints me, And they were like kind of taken aback, and I hope I reframed the way they were thinking about those guys. But everybody that tells you no is not your enemy. Sometimes they're your friend and they're trying to help you. And they're saying that's a bad plan. Don't go down in that valley, General Custer. It's not a good idea. That guy is actually not your enemy. So anyway, those are some things that a little down in the weeds one is talking to somebody from an organization, like say the state rep to a GIADF, the Department of State rep, and then sort of claiming to have coordinated with state. Just imagine if the horse is on the, if the shoe is on the other foot, you can't speak for a COCOM or SOCOM or JSOC or your commander, and they can't either. But they can be immensely helpful in helping you coordinate and telling you where to go and facilitating that rapidly and that kind of thing. So be careful not to be frustrated or to take advantage of the fact that you talk to somebody and then tell your boss, oh, it's all coordinated because I talked to, the GS-13 down in the basement. Anyway, that's a big list of do and don't, and that probably isn't as interesting as talking about it. But I don't know what if you had some other questions, David.
No, Paul. This has been fantastic. I really appreciate you sharing your wisdom and experience, and both covering the areas. Not only how to operate within the interagency so you're successful, and you're not one of those jerks. And some of the things to keep in mind, but also about preparing yourself to enter that environment so you have, not only an open mind, but an informed mind about the other organization. So thanks again for joining us, and look forward to future discussions.
Yeah, great. I appreciate it, and I hope that the audience will listen to this and think of it as just like a professional development challenge for, frankly, their whole career. And it never stops, by the way. I guarantee the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff spends a lot of time on this topic. So you don't grow out of it.